Hey guys, we're going to continue on today. We're going to continue on with the Age of Reason. Last thing we discussed last time was basically the abrupt end of the Rococo. Okay, the Baroque and the Rococo ended basically with the French Revolution right here in 1789. Now just to recap, 1776 is the American Revolution. So they're very much related. Today we're going to talk about, and you guys are going to see how close related French history it is with American history. So as I just mentioned, this new era, this continuation of the timeline, but after the Rococo, is called the Age of Reason, and it's called the Age of Reason because this has been a new way of looking at things from a much more populist point of view. Now, these points of view were not brand new. These points of view were brewing underneath the monarchy, both in Europe but also in the Americas. That's what drove the American Revolution and eventually, obviously, the French Revolution as well. So some of the ideas, some of this enlightenment that was happening included this idea of being rational and scientifically approached, just being completely uh, grounded on facts. So even religion, politics, social issues, economics, everything was bound by this idea of logic and rationale. Another thing that the Enlightenment brought was this attachment to democracy. This concept of liberty, self-determination, and secular concerns. If those three things sound familiar, it's because these are the same foundations that are used for the Constitution, and the same foundations for the American way of living, which is liberty, self-determination, and a separation of church and state, meaning no concerns for anything religion, so secular concerns. So this Age of Reason is looking at a specific timeline in the past, specifically Roman and Greek. We're gonna be seeing out of those two cultures which one the Age of Reason is more attached to. So there's a few things that we're going to look at, and it has to do with art itself, which is basically our focus. But what are the things that are happening here with art? So one of the biggest things to understand is that with the end of the Rococo, we had a collapse of the section, the business of art. So if you think of art as, let's say, oil, or you think of art as, let's say, real estate, or if you think of art as loans, right? It's just like any other sector of the economy. Well, if you think about the Rococo and the Baroque, the thing that was feeding the evolution of that culture of being able to showcase how much you own was through aesthetic means. So how could you show that you had the most power? Well, it was by over decorating the palaces, and in order to over decorate the palaces, you had to have artisans and artists who were creating all these beautiful things. So anyway, so you had a plethora of artists who were creating a bunch of different things for people left and right. So when the Rococo ended with the Age of Reasoning, when the French Revolution happened, all of a sudden this whole section of the market collapsed. You never think of kind of art being this kind of big section of society as an economic drive, because we always think as art as being poor, but in this case there were actually a huge area of the population who had money, and all of a sudden all these people went out of work completely, right? Because here the people who were paying for art was the royalty, the aristocracy, the people with money and power, and the church. And those three right there, all of those three people, or three groups of people, I mean, all of a sudden were no longer part of the society. They were no longer people who were in power, and nobody wanted to be associated with these three groups. If you ever heard the word bourgeoisie, right? These were the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie were the ones who you did not want to be associated, because these are the people who were being beheaded and were being trial by the French Revolution. Well, how do you know who the bourgeoisie were? Well, there were people who were wanting things, the people who were acquiring things, and all of these things were based on aesthetics, right? So artists and artworks, I mean, right? So artists did not longer have a job, to put it simply, right? Artists all of a sudden had a bunch of inventory in their houses, right? They had artworks, they had paintings, they had sculptures, they had all kinds of different things in their houses, and nobody were going to buy them, right? And let's say they were paid part for a commission, right? To make a commission work, but they weren't paid the rest, and now all of a sudden they had this commission work started or finished that was not going to get paid. So how are artists adapting? How are things changing for artists? Well, one of the things that happened is, out of the section of society, we had other groups who were still able to acquire art in some ways. These were not the bourgeoisie, however, they were the merchants and they were the bankers and other people who also had money, who still wanted to acquire some of those things that the super rich had or the powerful had. So they became the ones who started obtaining things, and those were the business class. Now the private collectors were those who, kind of still wanted to acquire the artworks, but were not loud about it, right? So we had private collectors and we had the business class. Now with the business class, how are you able to show your artwork? How can you show the items you had in your house, your inventory? Well, imagine that there was 10 of us, different artists. We all had a whole bunch of inventory, and one of us in the group had a big open storage place in one of the cities, or a place where we can all show our artworks at once. Well, this is the beginning of what now we consider, or we know, as a gallery. We bring all the artworks to this specific location. We call the people who we think can afford it or want to buy it, and then they come in, look at the stuff, and then purchase our inventory. Additionally to this, tastes are different. No longer is art the front of the conversation. That is no longer the case. People now are the ones who have the say so on what they want out of art. So it is not art who tells the culture what art is, but rather what the culture is telling art what art is supposed to be. So this plurality of styles begin by the fragmentation of the art world right here, right after the Rococo. And eventually this brings us into the isms, so Cubism, and all of those isms are part of this fragmentation of art. Alright, so I'm trying to move forward. Now, this era of the Age of Reason is culturally what we recognize that in art, this era is also known as Neoclassicism. So Neoclassicism is basically the Age of Reason, but in the art and architecture that really describes this time period, the switch between the Rococo and the next form of art and art representation. So with Neoclassicism, the aesthetic qualities that we're looking at is it says the emulation, but it's kind of the copying, the looking back, the mimicking of classical Greek and Roman art. Now, one of the things to understand here is that because the revolution is based on this idea of democracy and the growth of a revolution, we're going to see that Neoclassicism is not so much based on classical Greek, but rather Roman ideals. Right? We are going to have Greek context in there because Roman expanded on the Greeks, but really the Romans are the ones we're going to be looking at, because the Romans were the ones who once again were into revolutions, were into growing an idea and a power and all of those things. So Neoclassicism is definitely much more a Roman background than it is a Greek background. which is different, obviously, from the Renaissance. This other reformation that happens is the reformation of social culture in general, because we no longer are basing our ideas on a monarchy or a feudal system, but a new way of looking at things through the lens of democracy, right? So our social structure changes. Also, our overall taste changes, especially when we talk about, the overly indulging era of the Rococo and the Baroque, and the values as well. So the values of society, instead of being based on power, then it's much more democratic, where the power is on the people rather than the few. And we're going to demonstrate the power based on, once again, the culture, the people, rather than on those few who has the money and can showcase that power. And art is going to be a way of recreating, re-showing, reaffirming, in some way, in a propagandistic way, in a marketing way, how to change the views and the values and the new way of thinking. So art was going to show the beneficial social purpose. So why being democratic is important, right? Disenchantment of the frivolous and immoral, the frivolous immorality, which is what we're talking about here just a second ago. And that's basically tied to the Rococo and what's happening with the monarchy. And last but not least, once again, the representation of the Republic. So we're showing Rome, we're showing Romanistic or Roman ideas of republic, and how things are supposed to kind of be organized within that republic and with a democracy. Obviously, a non-hereditary government, which is not the opposite of a monarchy. And this is kind of the artwork that we're going to be seeing during the neoclassical period. Now, when you look at something like this, you're going to see a lot of Roman elements, right? So you see the semicircular arch, and you can see the helmets and all of those things. And a lot of times people think, oh, this is Roman art. But that's not the case, because Romans did not have canvases, right? They did not paint on canvas the way that the way that artists have been painting since the Renaissance at this point, right? So the fastest way to know that a piece of artwork is a neoclassical piece of artwork is by seeing Roman or Greek, elements on on a canvas, whether that's oil or other elements, but definitely oil and canvas with those elements. Automatically, you think this is neoclassical. Here we can see the things we're talking about, this kind of reorganization or reaffirmation of what our society should be, right? And this painting right here is done by one of the most influential artists of this era, which is Jacques-Louis David. Okay, so this is the Oath of the Herati, which is a story, a romantic story based in Rome. And you can see some of, like I mentioned earlier, some of the elements that they're trying to apply, not only social but also about republic, right, Romans, and also about fighting, being together, fighting for the same reason, organizing a military, all of those things attached to Rome, right? Very, 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 very different from what was the Rococo, right? So this is the huge difference between, Rococo style artwork and then obviously neoclassicism. Now, keep in mind the neoclassical art, or that style of painting of looking at the past, was happening in Europe anyways, and those ideas were happening in Europe. This was popular, let's put it that way, for those who had money. This is what it was before, right? So the Rococo, very a lot of romantic, concepts. And when I'm talking romantic in this case, are going to be much more emotional, romantic type of stuff. Everything's very soft. You can see a lot of elements here that we've discussed before about the Rococo. Very, very different, obviously, from that. So out of these elements, I wanted you to focus on this area right here. If you notice, with this reorganization of culture, uh, one of the things that is being re-emphasized, and something that could have changed at this point in a period of time, is kind of this depiction of what womanhood would be, right? What placement does women have within society, right? So in this case, we have women being, protectors, carers, damsel in distress, people who are not able, individuals who are not able to fight alongside for the same things, right? They were not strong, and they're not shown in this kind of strong manner as the men were. So, unfortunately for us, culturally, this division, this re-emphasizing of kind of uh, women being lesser of sorts was happening during the time period through art. Not only were male artists portraying it, but also unfortunately female artists as well. Here's another artwork. This is Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, pointing to her children as her treasures. Once again, women taking care of children instead of being part of the fight of the revolution or the ideals of a changing France. All right, so Jacques-Louis David, as I mentioned before, is a very important artist. Out of his artworks that he created during this time period, one of the most important ones that really pivoted Europe and pivoted France into a new era, is this specific painting. This specific painting of Marat coalesced the French Revolution. So up to this point, this is 1793. Up to this point, monarchy was still in power somewhat. The revolution was part of the conversation. There was uneasiness, kind of a social unrest between both groups, right? And Marat was a poet, a writer, and this individual was able to walk kind of both sides, both the monarchy side as well as the revolution side. And stupidly, if I may say this, one of the monarchs decided to assassinate Marat. So it was somebody that obviously was a friend or was an acquaintance of Marat. They came in and killed him right there in his bathtub. Jacques-Louis David, I would say in a very smart propagandistic type of way, decided to create a portrait of this horrific event, right? And since Marat was a writer, a poet, and he was much more associated with the revolution. With this, he created a martyr. He created an image for the revolution to coalesce, to bring all of those people together, and therefore formalizing and strengthening them to the point that they finally were able to take power and therefore bring Napoleon to power. It is extremely important to understand that the image created by this artist, this specific artwork, was the propaganda, the marketing, the one thing that brought Napoleon to power. Now, Napoleon was very smart. Napoleon knew that imagery had the possibility to create those changes, had the ability to be a way of changing perspectives and in some ways manipulating the audience that he was trying to create, that he was trying to communicate with, not create. Sorry. So anyways, so guess who he decided to have as the person who created his imagery, right? His paintings and basically his marketing. Yep, of course, Jacques-Louis David. So Jacques-Louis David went from being this kind of underground artist and rebellious and part of the revolution individual to basically the right hand of Napoleon. And Jacques-Louis David created a lot of these very iconic paintings from the neoclassical period when Napoleon took power. Here's another very impressive painting created during this neoclassical time period. one of the other things to see that are very much part of the aesthetic of this time period is something that came in from the Baroque. You know, in the Baroque we have these really large canvases. Well, large canvases continue to exist. However, at the end of the neoclassical period, canvases became extremely large. Paintings were very, very large, almost life-size, and in this case, actually larger than life-size. This painting right here, Napoleon, this figure right here is actually life-size on this canvas. That gives you an idea how large this whole painting is, right? So this is a painting by Jacques-Louis David, right? And this is the coronation of Napoleon. Now, on this image, you can see Napoleon already has been crowned as the emperor, as the person in charge. He is about to give the crown to his wife. To give you an idea how large this is, here's the painting at Louvre in France. Right? As you can see, the size of this man right here standing is about the same size as Napoleon himself. Now, Napoleon was a short man, so but it's almost about the same size. So it's an extremely large painting. And whenever you guys go to Paris and you go to the Louvre, this will be one of the masterpieces you will get to see. Here's another great kind of point of view of how large that painting is, right? And we're actually going to talk about a few of the artworks that are in this room in a minute. Now, here's probably one of my favorite parts of the whole year with my students. This is one of my favorite parts of the PowerPoint. And this is to talk about the neoclassical period and France, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and to showcase and tell you guys as students how connected and interconnected American history is with French history. How, you know, woven are all the elements that makes the United States and our idea of democracy what it is, and how they are connected to France. So one of the things to understand, and what you're looking at right now, is the image of Monticello. So Monticello is the house of Thomas Jefferson here in the United States. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a politician that spent a lot of time in France as well here in the New World. Thomas Jefferson was very much intricate part of both of the revolutions. He understood this need for democracy, for this need for no longer having a monarchy. All of those ideals we're just discussing, Thomas Jefferson was very much a part of it. And he really loved Europe. He really loved the arts and architecture and this kind of new way of looking at things, which was this combination of Roman history and contemporary idea, especially with French, with the French Revolution and the way of the French doing things. So when you're looking at this specific building, you know, at his house, you're looking at a very modernistic way of architecture, something that has not been seen before. If Thomas Jefferson was to live today, he would have a completely ultra-modern house with all the bells and whistles. You know, that's the kind of person Thomas Jefferson was. But this was kind of the top of the line in architectural design, and this is what we call neoclassical. And eventually we're going to call it something else, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Before I go into that, I want you to look at this right here. So this is Versailles. Versailles, the big palace that is very iconic French. Yes, it is part of the Rococo, it's part of the Baroque, you know, things are changing, but nevertheless it's very iconic of France and what French architecture looks like at this point. So everywhere you see, you're going to have a lot of this kind of buildings. So when you look at this and you look at Monticello, you can see there's some similarities, right? So one of the most striking similarities you can see right off the bat is going to be this kind of border right here, right? So you can see it also all around, right, the Monticello building. Now the other thing you're going to see is going to be this what is a chateau style roof. Here, the pitch is not very high, but you still have that a little bit in here. We're going to see other buildings that have much more prominent, that kind of French chateau style ceiling or roofing. Look at the windows as well, right? Very, very similar. So we can say there's a whole bunch of this kind of iconic French way of creating architecture throughout this whole building. Now, this is something very interesting, right? And we're very used to seeing this in the United States everywhere we see. But this combination of what we're seeing here in the center and all those French elements only happened or started happening at this point in history. So where did that come from? And hopefully for you guys, it looks familiar. Why? Because we've already seen it. And where do we see it? Right here. This is the Pantheon, sorry. This is the Pantheon. Now, if we remember about what this was for, right? The Pantheon had basically two things. One thing was this very beautiful Greek entrance, right? So it's very much like the Parthenon, which I was just saying, right? So it looks very Greek. You have Greek columns. And when we talk about Greece, anytime we have elements of Greek quality, we're always talking about knowledge, right? So we have this concept of knowledge, which the Romans had in this building. Now the other thing that is not very Greek whatsoever, but it's extremely Roman, is going to be this back area, right? So we're going to have the concrete, we're going to have the semicircular arch, which eventually, in this case, we're going to have the dome, and so forth and so on. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of what this building was used for. And what was it used for? Well, originally for the Romans is where they have all their gods, right? That's why it was called the Pantheon, because you had all the gods. So if you had all the gods and we had this beautiful dome, then the dome, was a representation of the heavens. Now, eventually, when Rome became Catholic, as I mentioned before, this became a church, so the house of God. So it still remained the same elements of religion, right? But now it's much more about Christian religion. However, the dome still resembled the heavens, and therefore a representation of God. So if we look at this building, right, here we have a combination of both France, the French ideals, right, everything that has to do with France, right, and then we have Rome, which is this right here, but not just Rome by itself, we also have Greece. So we have Greece, or knowledge, we have God, which is this representation of the dome, and then we have France, all those elements of France. This way of building is what we call the federal style. So if you ever go around in the United States and you see this kind of style of building, it's called federalistic style. However, it's part of the neoclassical era of art. Now, I tell my students and I tell everybody that in order for us to kind of completely disjoin ourselves from French history and stay away from them or not be part of that kind of French history would be extremely impossible. There were years in the 2000s where people did not want to be associated with France at all, and that's impossible. We are so rooted as a culture into France, it's not even funny. First of all, why do we have democracy, right? If French neoclassical ideas were not based in let's say Roman concepts of democracy, those ideas would have never made it to the to the New World, and therefore never would have made the fruition into the United States. We probably wouldn't have had a democracy. Imagine if the French or even us here, those in the revolution would have looked at Asian countries or a different way of government. They would never had a democracy. So it was because of French revolutionary ideas and neoclassical ideas that we have democracy in this country. Now, architecturally, this is even much more obvious. Look at this. Look at this building, for example. Right? We're just talking about the Federalist style of building. Well, if you recognize this building, this is the Capitol building. if you were to look at this and you wanted to say, well, we're not French, well, it would be really hard to say no. Look at this. Look at that border right there, right? Look at the windows. All of those things are basically French chateau. Same thing as Versailles, right? And then what else do we have in here? We have the columns, right? Knowledge. And then obviously we have a dome, which is God. This is federalistic style of building, a combination of French and Roman. Let's look at a different building, right? Here, this is the Supreme Court. Do you see similar elements? Look at the windows, right? Now in this case it's not as French chateau, it's a lot more Roman or Greek in this case, right? But definitely a context to that same idea of knowledge. But guess what? Inside as well we're going to have a dome, right? So we're also going to have God. Next one. This building right here, the White House, right? As American as it can be. Well, before we go that far, look at this wonderful edge right here. That is French Chateau. That's a very, very much French type of building, right? Look at the windows. Same thing. Very similar windows to the French Chateau, including the toppers right there, right? So we have the French. We have Greek, right? It looks like the Parthenon, the Parthenon or the Pantheon, both of them, right? And guess what? Do we have a circular room in that house? Yes, of course we do. So we have, God, knowledge, and the French. All right. Next one. This was a little bit closer to home, right? This was in Austin. Interesting. Look at the roof style. That is French Chateau, right? Look at the windows, right? But also look at the front, right? So we have this very simplistic but nevertheless existent, right? The topper right here of the Parthenon, and then all the Greek columns. Now they're simplified, but nevertheless, look at all the columns. And last but not least, obviously, we have the dome. So we have God, knowledge, and the French once again. But even closer to home, look at this, right? This is downtown Fort Worth. Do we have things that are also similar? Yep. Look at the French. Right, banister once again. We have the French style right there. Look at the roof style, even though it's very short here, but if you walk around it, you can see it better, which is the French style roofing. And then guess what? Look at this. The columns, right, the topper, and then another dome. So God, knowledge, and the French. So it's extremely hard for us as a culture, as an American culture, to deny the context, the mixture, the connection to French history. It is extremely impossible. Additionally, this is another part of our connection to France, right? Now, you're probably wondering, well, what does this obelisk have to do with France, right? Why, something that is very much Egyptian have to do with France? Well, my next question would be why out of all the objects in the world, the George Washington Monument is an obelisk, right? What is the point? Why is this Egyptian thing representing George Washington, right? So what's the point? Well, you have to look at history. You have to look at actually a French history to understand where this comes from. During Napoleon's period in power, right? Culture was looking back into history to find our connections to the past, right? So we looked into Rome, we look into Greece, but if you go further back into history, right? If you remember where we started basically all of this, we go into Egypt. So Napoleon invaded Egypt, right? And he brought a whole bunch of individuals to study Egypt, to try to find our connections to our past. And in this process of bringing so many Egyptian elements into Europe, Egyptian elements became a fad. People wanted to have all of these things that were Egyptian, a lot of elements that were Middle Eastern or African. And there's two parts to it. One, that there was a knowledge of this existence of this. However, there was also a distortion of who these groups were and who these people and individuals were, which unfortunately we still have remnants of that racist way of looking at the rest of the world through the Western eyes. But anyways, throughout all this way of looking at Egyptian for history as well as a fad, this is when the monument for George Washington was basically designed and created during this time period. So the elements that were the most culturally relevant were connected to their past and our history were to Egypt, and that's thanks to Napoleon, which was the person obviously in charge of France at this point. So we are extremely connected to the past. Now, I want to point out that during this time period, artists who were part of the Rococo, these ideas of storytelling and Roman elements, brought out something that we call the Romanticism, the Romantic period. Now, I really want to express, press, push, and plead to please understand that Romanticism, and the word romantic does not mean love, does not mean romance in the way you think of relationships. That has absolutely nothing to do with that. It's called romantic because it comes from the Romance languages. In other words, Roman languages. All right, Roman comes from the word Roman, romance, romantic. Okay, in other words, any language that has Latin as the base for the language. Okay, so any Latin language, okay, is basically a Romance language, and therefore Romanticism comes from all of that. Now, Latin languages, which brings me to another thing, right? The word Latin versus Latino, right? And that context of those two words. So Latin languages are the following. All Latin languages include Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Catalan, Provençal, and Romanesque. All of those were basically Latin based. Now, all of those individuals are Latin individuals. They're all Latin. So yes, the French are Latin, the Spanish are Latin, the Portuguese are Latin, Romanians are Latin, and so forth and so on. Now, when we say the word Hispanic, right, it is not interchangeable with the word Latin. It is not. Hispanic comes from the root of a previous country called Hispania, 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 that eventually changed the name to España, which translated to English is Spain. So what language do Spaniards speak? Spanish. So the only ones who are Hispanic are those who speak Spanish, while everybody else are Latin. So once again, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Catalan, all of those people are Latin people, right? Not just who speak Spanish. Now, good for those who speak Spanish because they're both Latin and Hispanic. Now, the word Latino is a different thing. Latino was a name given in the United States for anybody who spoke a language that sounded anywhere like Spanish. Okay, so it's basically a racist way of grouping anybody who spoke a language that was not understandable and it sounded somewhat Spanish, right? So that's Latino. So for me, for example, here in the United States, I don't like to be called Latino. Why? Because it's not a word that I chose to use, but it was given to me. I'd rather use the word Latinx. Latinx is different. It has a whole bunch of other connotations. But nevertheless, the reason why I mentioned everything I just mentioned is because I want you to be educated in the difference between Hispanic and Latin. Okay, they're not the same thing. They're not interchangeable. One of the things to understand about these Latin languages, the Romance languages, and the reason why this is called Romanticism is because Romans were known for exaggerating the truth a little bit, you know, kind of bringing power into the story. I mean, if you think about Roman gods, Roman heroes, Roman expansion, all of those things were kind of beyond what is expected, right? So if you think of a romantic or romance type of story, think of, you know, Latin soap operas, right? Over the top, over emotional, overly acted. So when you hear the word romantic, or romanticize. It just means that the story has been kind of inflated a little bit. It has been elements of fantasy has been added to it to make it much more interesting, um, or the truth has been just slightly changed to where it's much more palpable or much more interesting. So that's what romanticism means. That's what romantic means. That's what romanticizing means, is to change the truth slightly to create a better story. So in art, we have the same elements. So now we have two groups. We have the groups who were basically the Rococo artists who were into storytelling, right? And then we have the neoclassicist artists, which much more about kind of this strict guideline towards the past of Rome and democracy and so forth. So we have two big groups. Romantics are about emotion, imagination, while neoclassics are into reason, right, and logic. Romantics are looking into nature, right, the rural life, the common people, exotic objects like foreign lands, as I was mentioned earlier, the Middle East and Africa and things like that. However, they were also very interested on the now. What's going on right now? What's moving? What's happening? It's very much still that kind of humanistic approach to things. Neoclassics, as I mentioned before, right, and reason, they are much more tied about civilization rather than nature, right? We're talking about heroes, heads of state, power. Think of Rome once again when you think about neoclassical, very much Roman. And because we're looking at the past for kind of clues on how to behave and how to recreate our culture, the neoclassicism is very much about the past. So romantics are about the now, neoclassicals are about the past. And if you start thinking about culturally our own world, right, under the same umbrella of the importance of individual liberty, which both groups, tie themselves into, it's like looking at Democrats and Republicans, right? This idea of the now, what's going on right now, humanism, exotic things, nature, like the planet, and global warming and elements of that sort. While neoclassical ideas is much more Republican, conservative ideas are about the past, right? I mean, how much more simple can we get? Make America great again, right? The past. Looking at heroes, heads of state, power. This is very much culturally still tied to us from back in this time period of neoclassicism. Now that's 1820s, 1789, 1820s, and so forth, which is not that long ago, just a couple hundred years ago, but nevertheless. So when we're looking at romanticism, this is some of the artworks that you're gonna see. Now, once again, romanticism is about telling a story and kind of making it bigger, really connecting with the viewer through storytelling. So here's a very iconic artist from this time period, and this is Goya. And Goya was very much a pro-Napoleon kind of guy. He liked Napoleon's ideas of order, of democracy, of revolution against the monarchy, and so forth and so on. So he really liked that. However, as Napoleon expanded into Spain, right, and they took over, there was areas in Spain where people did not kind of wanted to follow suit with some of the things that were happening within the Napoleon troops, and how the way Napoleon was kind of creating his own world. Anyways, and I'm trying to simplify this quite a bit, guys. So anyways, people went from some of these towns revolted and wanted things to go different. Well, one of the ideas of democracy is that it's the people. It's the people have the right to say, the people have the right to change, the people are the voice of the government, say, right? But in this case, those who were not following the government, those who were not following, Napoleon's way of doing things, were collected and then obviously assassinated. Goya was appalled, obviously, what was going on. He was very distrustful of the world, and started, created this specific artwork of El 3 de Mayo on May 3rd, which describes what happened on that day. But also he created a whole bunch of series of works about war and the realities of war. Now I want to point out in this painting that you can definitely see the story of what's happening, but also you can see a hero, right? You can definitely see this person who is giving his life for what he believes, is a martyr, and he almost looks like he glows. Well, this is the way of storytelling, of getting this point across. So they're very much a romantic painting. Now, here's another beautiful romantic painting, right? This romantic painting comes from a different story, and this is the Medusa, right? So the raft of the Medusa, and this painting is very, very large, right? And it tells a story about a set of boats that were sent to fight, knowing that the seas were not friendly. Anyways, most of the boats collapse, and there's a story about this one specific boat, the Medusa, who had several survivors, and all the survivors just jump into this makeshift raft, and for weeks they drifted out at sea, and eventually they came to land, and some of them survived. Now, part of the story also says and talks about how they cannibalize each other, and it's just part of the story. So as the artist is telling the story visually, you can see all the possible elements of the story through a romantic kind of point of view, right? So the emotion, the despair, all of the different things in here, all the characters. But also I want to point out that on top of all the individuals you see here as characters, there's also another character that's very important to understand when it comes to romanticism. And that character is nature. Nature becomes another character in the storytelling of the romantic period paintings, as well as other artworks. So here nature is a foe, right? Nature is an enemy of these individuals who are at sea. So really beautiful artwork. Just to give you an idea how large the artwork is. Every single one of those here are almost human lives, human scale. Alright, here's another artwork from this time period. And this is one that we've seen before. So once again, storytelling. That is the whole point of romanticism. But here we also have some neoclassical elements, right? So we're talking about democracy and the revolution, but definitely romantic. Right? You see all the elements of storytelling. It's very much about the emotion. It's about the moment. It's about kind of the hurrah, everybody gathering together. And this painting is by Eugene Delacroix. And Eugene Delacroix becomes a very important artist from this time period as well, following Jacques-Louis David. And one of the things I want to point out here is that this is called liberty leading the people, right? So liberty is not really a person, right? It's an idea, it's a concept. So this is romanticized. I mean, this figure has been created from these romantic ideas of what liberty is, right? So this character is all by itself completely invented or renamed, right? An individual renamed to be liberty. So to give you an idea how large the painting is, here's the raft of the Medusa, and here it is liberty. Which brings me to another thing about talking about Lady Liberty, right? Lady Liberty in New York City, right? What is she wearing? What is she wearing? She's wearing a toga, right? A toga. This lady right here is also kind of wearing a toga. All of those elements are part of Roman culture, right? So the connection to Roman culture and to Greek culture through the neoclassical period. So that's why Lady Liberty in New York City wears a toga, right? All of these elements. Here's another one. Here is a very important American painting, very well recognized. This is, Washington crossing the Delaware, and once again we have all these characters. We have the story being told, and nature is also another character in this case. Beautifully here we have Napoleon, Washington, and Washington here wearing escape, his uniform almost like a toga as well, right? Once again, Washington here almost life-size. Very much a romantic artwork, part of the neoclassical period. Here we have a painting, right, that is completely nature. Nature as a complete character. In here we have fire as the main character, right? So this is the fire of the burning of the House of Lords and Commons. One thing to understand is that obviously the fire was not that large. I mean, it was large, but this, if you look at the bridge and you look at the size of the flames, this has been exaggerated, right? So this story is being exaggerated a little bit. It's being romanticized, and here we don't have any characters other than nature. Nature is the full, is the one who's given us the full story, and the artist has not only manipulated the fire but also changed what the river looks like. The river doesn't look like this. The river, you wouldn't be able to see it in that manner, right? So he has changed all these elements to tell the story, but the story is more important than the reality. Once again, we have another neat romantic artwork. This beautiful large landscape, right, where we can see nature as a character, right? So we see the pending storm, and then you have the beautiful other side with the sunny weather, but also here the human being part of that story, right? And that's Thomas Cole. And you do see this American painter at the Kimball Art Museum. A study of his, an understudy, or a person who took classes from him, or that taught him or was taught by, is this right here. So Robert Duncanson studied under Cole, and he created this kind of artworks as well. Same thing. So we have large landscapes and where we have story of sorts, but nature is the one who's telling us most of the story. Now Duncanson is one of the very few first African American artists that we talk about. He didn't do very well in the Americas. However, he did okay and fairly well in Europe. Now we get into the point that photography also becomes part of the conversation. So this is the late 1800s. Photography is a technology at this point, but artists are still very much part of the aesthetics of this time period, right? So we have very large, not very large photograph, but a photograph showing a very large landscape where once again the land and nature is a character, and then we have this individual here as part of the story. Now, one of the things to understand is that this time period, photographer had to smear glass with just the right amount of toxic chemicals, insert into a camera, expose the plate for the correct number of seconds, and develop the image almost immediately by applying more toxic chemicals in complete darkness. Right? So this was not an easy image to create. It took a long time, but nevertheless, once you had the image, you had it. So imagine if you were a painter. Right? Imagine if you were a person that would take months to create a painting, right? And now you have this technology that even though it was toxic and it was kind of cumbersome, could recreate nature, almost like magic. How would you feel, right? How would you really feel about this whole new thing? I imagine similar to people nowadays who feel like robots are taking over their jobs, right? Whether clerks or whether it's manufacturing or whatever else. One of the things to note is that technology it becomes an aid, and even for artists. So artists here were worried. However, Eugene Delacroix, this artist, said this about photography: a daguerreotype which is a type of photography, as hopefully you remember, is the mirror of the object. Certain details almost always overlooked in drawing from nature take on its characteristic importance, and thus introduce the artist to complete knowledge of construction, as light and shade are found in the true character. So what he's saying here is that, you know, the artist can look at the subject matter and it still kind of has flaws through the eye, right? There is um, different things that the artist, the artist can't see. However, a picture captures all of those elements, right? It's a complete mirror of the object. And for the things that we're not able to see through the eye, then the picture can actually hold it, right? Now, if the artist is able to look at the picture and continue to look at the picture, right, it can complete kind of this form, the artwork can make it even better. So art is using photography to help their craft rather than to be diminished by it. Another thing to keep in mind is that behind the camera there needs to be somebody, a person who is working with the technology, somebody that understands, all the elements and principles of design. So in other words, an artist. So even though this technology exists, without the individual behind the camera, there's no image. There's no proper image. So Eugene Delacroix understood all of those elements. Here's another artist, another photographer taking images during this time period, right? He's taking images of very famous individuals. So Nadar takes images of everybody. Now, because it is a neoclassical period, right, and he's taking images in this context, you're going to see this, for example, right? She looks like she's wearing a toga. Yes, she looks like she's wearing a curtain, but nevertheless, she looks very Greek, right, or very Roman. And look at this right here, this column-like thing, right? Also very Greek, very Roman. So very neoclassical. Whenever you see images of the big painters from, the modern movement, so whether it's, I just went blank of most of the artists, dear Lord. So if you think of, oh dear Lord, all the impressionistic artists like Van Gogh and Rodin and Matisse and so forth and so on, all those images you see black and white of those artists are actually taken by Nadar. Here's an artist we've already seen before, right? We have Cameron here with the images. Now this is a lot more romantic rather than neoclassical, right? But nevertheless, we still have some neoclassical elements, right? We have this little kid dressed like a, like a little Roman. Remember I mentioned before how, his attire and how it was kind of odd? Well, now it makes sense, right? These were kind of the aesthetic qualities of the time, this kind of enamorment or looking back into history, into, Roman, Greek, and even Egyptian style type of things. Now, another thing that we see here, this very Asian style umbrella, which is an exotic object, right? Very much part of that romantic way of looking at things. Hopefully all of that makes sense. Now, as things are working in the world right now, the person who is in charge is Napoleon, and his right hand, in regards to the marketing, in regards to the aesthetics, in regards to the kind of this new world of visuals and art, the person who is his right hand is going to be, obviously, and you already guys know, is Jacques Louis David. So the state, Napoleon creates this wonderful thing, quote unquote, which is called the School of Fine Arts, right? So the College of Bon Arts, and this institution, right, it is sponsored by the state, meaning it's being paid by Napoleon, by France, right? Well, in this school, right, which, basically made artists, right, had this kind of idea about art, and the ideas were very much tied to neoclassical elements, right? So in other words, a great painted a great painting or a great artist demanded that his artworks, those artworks, were classical in technique and had elevated subject matter. So classical techniques, meaning very well rendered, that you can recognize all the elements, right? That it looked very Renaissance, or they look very Baroqueish, and all of those elements that were very much in the classical context of art, right? Just look at Rome or look at Greece, right? And elevated subject matter, meaning power, meaning heads of state, meaning all of those things were elevated subject matter. So only those things that once we can recognize that were popular and were done properly were considered good art, nothing else. Now that sounds familiar, I hope it does, because this is the way that most people nowadays in the world, including yourselves when you started this class, looked at art, right? For you to consider normally good art, or even the way that you have described the artwork in your exams, they're basically about that, right? You look at it, if you don't recognize it, if you recognize it, most of the time you call it good art. If it's really well rendered and it's quote unquote pretty, then all of a sudden it's good art. If not, then if it takes you time to think about what the artist is trying to do or say or whatever, then all of a sudden it might not be good art, right? So these concepts, these cultural concepts of art that we have nowadays, and the reason, unfortunately, why you're having to take this class to understand what art is because of this, right? Because of this way of basically organizing art. Those individuals who follow this way of thinking, right, were given the privilege of showing in the salon, which is basically the place to become an artist. So if you made it into the salon at this period of time, then you made it as an artist, you were collected, you made money, and so forth and so on. So everybody wanted to be part of that, right? This one annual exhibition, as I just said, created recognition, and therefore you made money. Anyways, for Delacroix, right? Remember the same guy that painted Liberty, right? He was saying that this specific location was teaching art as if it was algebra, right? Teaching beauty as though it was algebra, right? And that's something that unfortunately we still have a problem nowadays, as I just mentioned, right? You guys have to come to my class in order for you to understand that this way of applying the concepts of art to kind of making what art and art isn't based on those ideals is not right, right? The teaching beauty as it was algebra, I'm having to kind of, the whole point of this class is to kind of break those elements down so you can see the beauty beyond those kind of templates. All right. Now, from that it gets us into realism. So realism, what is realism? Now, realism, unfortunately, is something that people get wrong all the time, right? Because when people think realism, they think, oh, it looks like nature. Well, that is not the case. Realism just basically means that it's real life. Not because it mimics nature, not at all, but rather because the content of it is about real life. So in other words, if we were to paint a realistic painting of today, of what's going on in the world today, then we'll make paintings of people wearing masks and people wearing gloves, rubber gloves, and people staying in their houses. Why? Because that's real life. That's what's happening right now. So that kind of painting will be a realistic painting. That is not to be confused with naturalistic, meaning that it looks like nature, right? So you can have both a naturalistic painting that's realistic, but also you can have an abstract painting or an abstract painting that is also realistic. Because realism has to do with the subject matter, not with the way it looks. Okay, so you probably heard me all throughout the semester kind of going back and forth or kind of avoiding to say the word realism when really truly what we mean is naturalism, right? So with realism, there's no idealism. You paint what you see. Nothing exotic, right? You paint what you see. Nothing nostalgic, meaning the past. If you don't see the past, you're not going to paint it. You're going to paint what's going on right now. So no nostalgia. In other words, a rebellion against academic art, a rebellion of what the School of Fine Arts was doing. The School of Fine Arts wanted you to stay in the past, paint like the, Renaissance, paint like the Baroque, paint like, Greeks or Romans were doing it. That's the past, right? This is not what realists are wanting to do. The realist wants to paint what's going on right now. The things that are going on right now. They don't want to paint Rome. They don't want to paint the past. They don't want to paint like the past. They want to do what is right now. Reality. Realism. So how much more real can you get than, having to break stone to take to the market to sell for stoves? That's as mundane of a job as it can be. A father and a son, working really, really hard every day to get a little bit of money. Now, why do you need stones for stoves, you wonder? Well, pretty simple. If you have a wood stove, and normally what you do is you'll throw some rocks in there and the rocks will stay hot. And if you wanted to warm some food, since you don't have a microwave back then, right, then what you do is, you have the really hot stones, and then you can warm some food up really quickly. So, this is as mundane can get. So this is not an elevated subject matter, right? This is not heads of states or gods or anything like that. This is just everyday people, right? And then the way it's being painted, for us, we can see it and we'll go, wow, that's pretty nice. We can recognize everything. But actually, for that time period, it actually lacked detail. It lacked a lot of that elements that were, part of that kind of rendition that they were expecting. So anyways, I'm going to stop right here. It's right at an hour, and I will continue with this lecture tomorrow. All right, I'll talk to you later, guys. Bye.